We are speaking with Rupert Darwall, who was an investment banker and special advisor to the chancellor of the exchequer at the UK Treasury. He is a policy analyst, the author of The Age of Global Warming, and his latest book is Green Tyranny, Exposing the Totalitarian Roots of the Climate Industrial Complex. Thank you for joining us, Mr. Darwall.
It's my pleasure.
Now, I once taught environmental politics at university in Mexico, and the course syllabus I had created traced some of the same history that you outline in your book. What I discovered about climate change was that, in reality, it first began as a political agenda and not a scientific problem. It wasn't as if scientists said, hey, look, we have a problem and we have data to support our theory of the problem. I find that it was a political agenda that sought to fix facts to support policy. And in many cases, data was fabricated. You know, we had Michael Mann with the hockey stick graph that cannot be replicated, East Anglia University's email scandal, and the acid rain scare that you talk about that was meant to target the coal industry. It seems the science has become twisted. Could you tell us about this politicization and weaponization of climate change and environmentalism for political agenda?
Sure. I think you have absolutely put your finger on it, in that scientists knew there was a problem. Their theory said there'll be a problem, so they then searched for evidence to demonstrate that that was the case. And actually, this is the second book I've written. The first one was called The Age of Global Warming, and in the last chapter, I contrast global warming with cigarette smoking and lung cancer, because often you get people like Al Gore say, well, it's like lung cancer, smoking causing lung cancer. In fact, it's not, and the history of this is really interesting. So in that book, I looked at what happened in Britain, because there was an epidemic of lung cancer through the 20th century. The big communicable diseases fell away, like typhus and cholera and TB and so forth, through the 19th century. And then lung cancer began to take off, and no one knew why. And after the Second World War, the government asked some researchers, why is this happening? So they devised a series of questions. They looked through the records of people who had lung cancer, and they devised a questionnaire. And interestingly, the two researchers who embarked on that, when they started off, they were both smokers. They didn't have a predetermined idea of what they would find at all. Now, with global warming, as you rightly say, what we had was scientists who had a theory and then set out to prove it. Now, the interesting point about that is the link with the politicization. Why did this scientific notion become deeply politicized? And in my second book, Green Tyranny, I trace that back to Sweden and the Swedish Social Democrats of the late 1960s, early 1970s. And they wanted to build a huge number of power stations, nuclear power stations, and to give Sweden the highest per capita nuclear power of anywhere in the world. And the thing is, nuclear power wasn't very popular in Sweden. So that what they did was they said, it was like a Project Fear. They said, okay, if we don't have nuclear, we'll have to have coal. And Sweden is a country, it's almost unique in Western Europe with virtually no coal. So they said, well, if you have coal, the first thing is you'll have acid rain and it will destroy our forests, and our lakes will fill up with sulfuric and nitric acid, kind of thing. And then they started that in the late 60s, and then in the early 70s they switched to global warming. You will also have climate change, and it'll melt the Arctic ice cap, and vast, terrible things will happen. And it was actually the Swedes, it was very much Swedish diplomacy and Swedish scientists who were the midwives, who really were behind the creation of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 1988. So you're absolutely right. This was politicized and then weaponized for political reasons right from the very start.
And to take a step back before the Swedes in the 70s, as you mentioned, you also write about, and it's kind of frightening, this description of the history of the environmental movement having some of its roots in totalitarian Nazi Germany. Some of it's rooted in the pagan sun worship and symbolism. And we know the Nazis, they had their eugenics system. And we see some of that in today's movements with the calls to regulate population control and reproduction. So can you tell us a little bit about the history rooted in Nazi Germany?
Yeah, I think there are two things. One is something that's almost specifically in German culture and German philosophy, German thought, which is that although Germany was, in a way, the biggest single winner from industrialization, or the second wave of industrialization from the late 19th century and the 20th century, and Bismarck united, the power of Germany was based on coal and steel and a mechanized armed forces, a mechanized army. And yet at the same time, there is within German culture a revulsion against industrialization, a back to nature movement, that actually we belong in the unsullied forests and so forth. And it's basically an irreconcilable, almost bipolar problem that Germany is incapable of resolving. So there's this sort of metaphysical problem that Germany has about industrialization. And there's also something specifically about the Nazis and Hitler's ideology, which is very different from sort of traditional Marxism and communism, in that they believed that nature and the laws of nature overpowered and were more important than, if you like, human laws. If you think about Marx and the laws of history, those are human laws, whereas the Nazis believed in the law of biology. So that's how the categories of history, if you like, are racial ones, and they're Darwinian and so forth. So they imported the categories of biology and the natural sciences into politics. And again, you see this very strongly in the environmental movement today, where they say we're subject to limits, and as you rightly point about there's this fixation with population control, and the brutality of population controls completely seems to escape them. But it's this idea that we are creatures, we are subject to biological laws. That first came, that philosophy you first get in politics with the National Socialists and with Adolf Hitler.
And if we could just explore this a little bit more, because, radical environmentalists today might say, oh, that was 70 years ago, this Nazi environmental movement and ideology. But, correct me if I'm wrong, I've noticed a lot of similarities in today's movement. And I've made notes of some of these proposals, which I would consider totalitarian by the climate change movement today. I want to make a brief list of them. One example I remember was a UN report for Mexico suggesting forced relocation of populations. I have a home in Mexico, and I suppose this means that they could forcibly evacuate me from my home if they wanted to. Other suggestions they've made: give up meat, eat hamburgers made from human excrement that were developed, I believe, in laboratories in Japan. They say camels and cows cause too much CO2, so they should be greatly reduced in number. They want to have the power to turn off our home energy if we've used too much. And then there was that infamous 1010 film where they violently blew up the heads of people who disagreed with them. Can we draw a line from that Nazi ideology to today?
Yeah, we can, and I'll come back to that in just a moment. But what is really quite disturbing about, I found, researching and writing the chapter on the Nazis, which I call it's chapter 4 in the book, Europe's First Greens, is that virtually every single theme of the modern environmental movement you find there in the Nazi period. So Hitler said if he won the Second World War, he'd ban meat eating. They for the same reason as put out by modern environmentalists, that they consume too much, that livestock consume too much grain. Goering at one stage called German farmers who fed grain to livestock, he called them traitors. They complained about modern advertising techniques, which led people to overconsume food and eat the wrong kind of food. They believed that industrialization caused cancer. And what's very interesting about that is that tenet of Nazi medicine found its way into the notorious cancer chapter of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring. I think it's called 1 in 4, the idea that 1 in 4 people was going to die from cancer. And as Rachel Carson said, industrialization means that we live in a sea of carcinogens. And she got that from Nazi medicine. And the link there is with a German-American doctor physician, I think he was in Pittsburgh, who, when the Nazis came to power, went back to Germany, picked all this stuff up, came back, and if you look at the citations for that chapter in Silent Spring, it's littered with references to him. Of course, that Nazi medicine, with one exception, turned out to be completely wrong, and one exception is with cigarette smoking. But that you won't find the tobacco leaf mentioned in Silent Spring. And I think probably the thing that really hit home when I was researching the book was something that Adolf Hitler told an aide. He said, "I'm not interested in politics. I'm interested in changing people's lifestyles." And that is exactly what we have today with the environmental movement. So I think that whole period stands as a very sinister warning about what happens when people want to take control of people's lives for environmental ends and control them and sacrifice what to me is the most important political value, which is human freedom.
And let's look at some of the economics of their proposals. A large part of your book goes through in technical detail of the economics of the deindustrializing our way of life and changing our lifestyle. Personally, I enjoy solar technology. I have a solar laptop bag. I would love to have my house one day run on solar technology, but you make the point that solar and wind on a mass scale is completely unfeasible and cannot replace carbon energy sources. I'm living here in -20, -30 degrees Central Asia at the moment. I surely cannot fathom 100% renewable energy in this part of the world, especially with the abundance of coal, gas, and oil. Could you comment on the economics, and would it be possible 100% renewable energy in the future?
The fundamental problem is that wind and solar are intermittent. They are weather dependent. They don't respond to demand. They respond to the weather. And this again was something that you find a problem that they had in the Nazi period. It will come as no surprise, given what we've just talked about, that the Nazi Party was the first political party anywhere in the world to have a wind power program. And their answer, the Nazi engineers, their answer to this problem of intermittency was, well, we need to store the wind energy by converting it into hydrogen and transform ourselves into a hydrogen-based society rather than a coal-based society. And you get that today where people, I saw an article recently, but Stephen Chu, who was President Obama's first energy secretary, he said batteries aren't good enough for grid scale intermittent to store grid scale intermittent wind and solar. We have to convert it into hydrogen. And we're hardly any closer to solving that problem, that big, huge engineering chemical problem, than the Nazis were sort of 9 decades ago. So this is a fundamental problem to do with the technology of intermittent electricity generation. And as yet, there is no solution. So what we've got is we put the cart before the horse. The horse is solving the storage problem. The cart is the wind and solar. But this whole thing is driven by ideology, and then of course you get massive rent seekers just pile in on the back of it, and so it's going to be a very, very difficult thing to throw off.
Yeah, and talking about the economy, and there's this immense amount of money at play. The climate alarmists point the finger at capitalist industry, but you know what they say: for every finger you point at someone, 3 fingers are pointing back at you. And indeed, there's this, you write about it in Green Tyranny, this revolving door of NGOs, lobbyists, green technology companies, and government agencies swimming in cash. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's what I call the climate industrial complex, and it's composed of, as you say, the NGOs, it's government bureaucrats and regulators, it's university academics and think tanks, and a lot of the funding for this not only comes from governments but also the multi-billion foundations, the old ones in the US such as Rockefeller and Ford and so forth, but the new ones from the Silicon Valley oligarchs who've been funding a lot of this, and it's not just in the US; it flows across Europe. They finance some of the European initiatives. Indeed, the European Commission in turn funds a lot of these activities, and the European Commission and some European governments are in turn funding some of the think tank works for the World Resources Institute in Washington. So there's this whole nexus of cash, of expertise, and then of course there's the billions and billions of dollars that then go into wind and solar. So there's a big industry and behind this. It's not just the people the Siemens and so forth who actually make the kit. It's the people who finance it. That's really where the money is. That's where you take the big turn, is the people financing and investing in this. And so you've got a massive, great vested interest that's been created. And interestingly, the German Greens, Joschka Fischer wrote in a book, we had to create a green class of entrepreneurs, people who have an economic benefit from all this, because Fischer was a Marxist. He was a 1968 radical, so he understood, class interest. So they went out to create a new class with a huge interest in this.
And in Green Tyranny, you detail how the New Left became radicalized out of Europe's Frankfurt School. There was this long march through the institutions. They marched right into American academia. And, I was quite taken aback when I personally witnessed in the university where I taught, I gauged my students, my classes, and there were international students there as well. The large majority were disproportionately left-wing, as well as left-wing radical environmentalists. And, it's nice to have a diversity of opinion, to have people from the center, from the right, from the left, but I find it uncomfortable when, 95% of the class is left-wing radical environmentalists. Can you talk about what's happened in academia?
Yeah, I think that the Frankfurt School has been the worst single import into America there's ever been. They have done a huge amount of damage to American university life, and these were people. They were Marxist intellectuals based in Frankfurt. They saw their fear of Hitler was not because most of them were Jews, but they didn't. It wasn't the anti-Semitism of Hitler they feared. It was that they were Marxists or really post-Marxists, and they developed this synthesis of Marxism and Freudianism. Sorry about the dog. In a way to explain what they needed to do was to explain why the proletariat wasn't in the vanguard of the revolution. Actually, the proletariat was actually satisfied with capitalism and the living standards that capitalism was giving them. So they had to say that, well, the proletariat had been conned by the merchants of kitsch into being subdued. So they developed this whole alternative, this cultural explanation, this Freudian explanation for why capitalism was bad and why it wasn't being overthrown. And these people, they came to Frankfurt School, they first went to Geneva and then New York, and then their influence has spread throughout American universities. And there was one thing, what you get is this sort of twisting of reality, of meaning, of language, which I think is ultimately so destructive of academic discourse. So Herbert Marcuse wrote an essay called Repressive Tolerance, where tolerance, which is clearly the antithesis of repression, becomes repressive because it's used by capitalism. And you read through the essay, and it just tortures those words. It twists them and changes them so it actually turns them around. And it's this ability to vacate meaning from words. So everything becomes twisted, negative, and nihilistic. And that's ultimately where, again, writing this book, you got there's this link with the irrationalism and nihilism of National Socialism, and if you like, the irrational right, if you care to call it that. But it's where they join up. And I was very much influenced in researching the book, and I put it in the book by a very famous essay by Paul Berman called "The Passion of Joschka Fischer." And there he writes about the New Left and the 1968ers and the Frankfurt School, and he talks about how this movement of radical students in Germany they started off as being against National Socialism and against the former Nazis who were still in West Germany, and they turned out Nazi-like, that they actually adopted the positions the Nazis had. And where I extended that analysis into environmentalism, that they actually then adopted the environmental tenets that actually had previously lain dormant in post-war Germany, but we saw very strongly in the Nazi period.
And in chapter 23, you write about the spiral of silence, which is another tactic I think they use, especially in the media today, to silence opponents and build consensus. Can you just briefly explain what is this spiral of silence?
The Spiral of Silence is a book written by possibly the person who is the most important opinion pollster of the post-war era, Elisabeth Noelle Neumann, and she was a very, very interesting woman. As I say, she was West Germany's leading pollster. She worked for the CDU, the Right of Centre Party, but before the war, she won a scholarship to study polling, and she was awarded the scholarship by Goebbels' Ministry of Popular Enlightenment and Propaganda, and she studied polling techniques in America, and then she went back and she actually worked for Goebbels for a short time. She was fired after a bit. But what was very interesting was she then, in the post-war era, she noticed that people didn't say things when they were answering questions to pollsters. They didn't actually respond in a way that people really believe they weren't telling the truth about what they really thought. And she noticed that what happened when a view becomes overwhelming, that it becomes a sort of socially accepted view, that people actually retreat. They stop saying this is what I think, and they withdraw into themselves. And it's a very powerful mechanism, because you can. And it operates through the media. So if people don't see their views reported or commented on, those views eventually die. They stop being expressed. People don't even have the language to express them. So it's an incredibly powerful tool in a way. And we see that tool being used in the climate debate, where people are called deniers, they're delegitimized, they're not allowed to you can't have debate, their science is settled, and so forth. So you see this very, very powerfully, and it's the biggest weapon in their toolkit, in my view.
And early on in the book, you cite some of the environmentalists and their ideology to their desire to create some type of single global authority or world government. To me, this sounds a bit too much. I think the idea of having a world government in itself isn't good or bad, but the question is, what kind would it be? And I think history shows us that every single form of government we've ever had, whether it was tribal, city-state, nation-state, or empire, eventually dissolved into corruption. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. And having a world state, I think, would eventually also dissolve into corruption or tyranny or whatnot. And I often ask myself, am I crazy for not desiring A world state, or is that a crazy idea? Can you tell us about this?
Well, I think, I mean, a world state would mean the end of, in my view, it would represent the end of freedom, because no world government could be accountable to voters in any meaningful way. And ultimately, one's recourse to a government and a country that one doesn't like is to leave and go somewhere else. And with a world government, obviously that is closed. But of course, if the objective is to save the planet from a planetary catastrophe, kind of everything is justified. And again, I think it's the last or penultimate chapter I cite the French philosopher Pascal Bruckner, who talks about the future again as it was under communism and Christianity, the future being the great category of blackmail. So we are being blackmailed in order to save the planet. We have to sacrifice various things, and of course the biggest sacrifice we're being asked to make is our freedom. And that's why I said if reading the book, as you go back right to the beginning, this is a book about freedom. Fundamentally, this is an issue about whether we continue to be free.
I suppose when Elon Musk gets his spaceships going to Mars, that'd be one way to escape a world state. But I'm just joking. But you seem to downplay the threat of a nuclear winter. I'm currently living about 200 kilometers from the principal Soviet nuclear test site, the Polygon, which had over 500 bombs dropped on it. Life here has moved on and seems fine. I personally do kind of fear a nuclear winter if enough nuclear warheads were used, I suppose. But could you tell us about your view on the nuclear winter scare?
Yeah, the nuclear winter scare happened in the early 1980s, and it was a product of the climactic decade of the Cold War. And the background to this was that in the 1970s, the Soviet Union started to deploy medium-range SS-20 nuclear missiles, and the thing about those missiles was they could hit Western Europe, but they couldn't hit the United States. So they were a tool for detaching Western Europe from the US nuclear umbrella, and therefore, in a sense, neutralizing the American nuclear umbrella as far as Western Europe was concerned, and effectively neutralizing the Atlantic Alliance. And in fact, it was the West German leader Helmut Schmidt who said, we have to counter this. And so the Atlantic Council agreed a twin-track way forward, which was to counter the SS-20s with cruise and Pershing missiles, and at the same time enter negotiations with the Soviet Union so that deployment of those and the SS-20s wouldn't need to take place. And the Soviet Union hit back very, very hard. It waged an intense propaganda campaign to frustrate deployment of cruise and Pershing missiles, and the Pershings were the key arena for that was West Germany. That's where they were going to go, because West Germany was on the front line of the Cold War. And the Soviet Union put an enormous amount of effort into the propaganda, to supporting the peace movements, particularly in West Germany. And one of the things that popped up on this was the nuclear winter. And it emerged after a Russian defector. He revealed that actually the nuclear winter hypothesis had been developed by Andropov and the KGB. It was planted in Stockholm in Sweden. There was a paper written in Ambio, an environmental journal of Sweden, and it then got picked up and had massive play in the United States. and you had a whole raft of scientists led by the cosmologist Carl Sagan, who got behind this and said, if there's a nuclear exchange, there'll be a nuclear winter, and it's likely that Homo sapiens across the northern hemisphere and possibly even the southern hemisphere will become extinct, and it's the end of everything, kind of thing. Well, this only served the interests of this thing only served the interests of the Soviet Union. It was designed to undercut the Reagan administration's arms build-up, which fortunately went ahead and actually resulted in Gorbachev deciding this was a game that they weren't going to win, and that led to the de-escalation of the Cold War and indeed the end of the Cold War. So the big takeaway from that chapter is that the scientists involved in that were objectively playing to the strategic interests of the USSR and against those of the United States. And the irony is that these people who got the Cold War so wrong, in a few short years later, were the lead ones on the global warming. There are only two climate scientists I found who were on the, if you like, the US side and actually did that as scientists turned out to be right on nuclear winter, who were then involved in global warming. But the scientific community as a whole lined up behind all the scare of nuclear winter, and therefore were effectively acting as sock puppets for the Kremlin.
And I like the term that you use beside climate industrial complex. You say climate deep state. You've also mentioned the Swedish deep state. You say the U.S. Democratic Party has become the political arm of the climate deep state, and that the working class basically elected Donald Trump because of a dying economy, deindustrialized economy, and the ridiculous identity politics. Do you see a turning of the tide, or will radical environmentalism succeed in establishing some type of dystopian Fourth Reich, like Philip Dick's Man in the High Castle or something?
Well, I think where you can see that dystopia is in California, where, and I've got a chapter on California there, where it's very difficult to see where an alignment of political forces is strong enough to overcome what's already there, where you have the Silicon Valley oligarchs, you have the media establishment of Hollywood and Los Angeles, and you have very, very wealthy. You have a lot of coastal wealth, and in the interior of California, you actually have quite a lot of poverty. It's almost kind of the segregation is almost like South Africa. The segregation of wealth and opportunity in that state, and it's very difficult to see that political force is strong enough to overturn that. But I think across the U.S., there is a genuine crisis for the party of the left, the Democrats, because they came into being really to advocate and represent the interests of working people, and it was about better living standards. It was like, they were about aligned with trade unions for better wages, better conditions, better lives. And they have, what's happened with the Democrats, they've lost their linkage with their blue collar base, with, if you like, their middle class working family base, and they've basically sold out to the environmental oligarchs. You've also got there's also a middle class in America that is quite is white collar and is into environmental issues and so forth. And so that on the Democrat side, you've got a whole raft of, or what was on the Democrat side, a whole raft of a demographic of a class that is really up for grabs. And of course, a lot of those shifted to Donald Trump in 2016. But I think it's very hard for the Democrats to recover from that, because basically they've been captured by the climate industrial complex, which has turned the Democratic Party into the political arm, the political wing of the climate industrial complex.
And is there any final point I may have missed that you'd like to mention? Any final thoughts or comments, bottom line or conclusion we should take away regarding radical environmentalism or climate change?
I think the most important thing is to understand what it is. And once you've understood its underlying motivations, where it comes from, its genealogies, you're on to that is the first step in defeating that. The second point, I think, is that eventually all this comes up against a reality, and we're beginning to see that reality. The two places I point to would be Germany, where the reality of the Energiewende is it just doesn't work. I mean, it's like communism collapsed because ultimately it didn't work. And similarly in Australia, you have some incredibly radical, green radical, actually again, a Labour Party in South Australia, where you've had blackouts, you've got the world's most expensive electricity prices. And there comes a point where the ideology is defeated by reality. And that is the moment that one needs to be aware of and point out for what it is, that this is reality, is something that you can't fight. The ideology has to surrender to the reality. Okay, and I totally agree. And how can people best follow and support your work? They can get your previous book, Age of Global Warming, I believe, on Amazon and in bookstores, as well as Green Tyranny. Is there anything else you'd like to mention? Yeah, I write quite a lot, and I put all my stuff up on Twitter, and there'll be a website coming up shortly where I've got a lot of writing. I've got an article which you might care to link to on Quadrant, the Australian website looking at the renewable lessons that are coming out of Germany and Australia. Yes, indeed. I will do that. Send me the link. And thank you again, Mr. Darwall, for your the research. It was a dense book packed with a lot of information, but a great book. And thanks for shedding light on this green tyranny. It's been great talking to you. Now, I'm sorry for having the dog messing, having the dog on the tape as well. Hope your listeners can put up with that.